Okay, so we're going to start on the skeletal system now. We talked about what cells are, and then we looked at tissues, looked at all the different tissues that are on the body. So in your lecture, you're looking at physiology mostly, and so here we're going to start talking about various organ systems. We talked about organ systems early on and what those are. So the first one we're going to look at in this in the lab is the skeletal system. We're going to look at the nervous system next, and then we'll look at the endocrine system and the integumentary system. And I think those are So anyway, so what is the skeletal system? That's what we're going to start introducing you to today. We're talking about bone structure and function. And the next class, we're going to talk about the axial skeleton, which is the skull and the spinal cord or vertebral column and ribs. And then we'll talk about the appendicular skeleton, which is arms and legs. The class after that. So leave you with a couple of quotes, a couple I like. Audrey Hepburn, nothing is impossible. The word itself says I'm possible. And Ralph Waldo Emerson said, do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. So, okay, next slide. So what are the functions of the skeletal system? The skeletal system does several things for you. One, it protects things. So it protects vital organs like the brain, protects the rib cage, protects heart and lungs, and so there's a lot of protection that goes on. It also protects things that are internal to the bones, like the red blood, bone marrow. So you have blood cell formation. There's nothing that happens. You also have fat storage. So you have storage inside the bones. You also have mineral storage. And so you store minerals like calcium and phosphate because your bones are made of calcium phosphate. And you have cells that can take calcium out of the bones and cells that can put calcium back into the bones. And an imbalance of those two can lead to osteoporosis. And you also, those mineral storage with phosphates also helps with acid-base homeostasis. And you're going to hear the word homeostasis a whole lot, probably more so in lecture than here. But just remember, that's the balance that your whole body goes through to keep things in balance, and it refers to mineral balance as well as various other functions in the body. So we have protection, mineral storage, blood cell formation, fat storage. The skeletal system is also involved in movement, because if you have muscles but no skeletal system, you're just a blob sitting on the floor and you kind of lump along. But if you have the skeletal system, then the muscles have something to pull against, and then you can move in a more ordered fashion. So you have support. So the skeletal system supports the weight of the body through the feet and the legs, going up the hips, supporting the upper body, and the vertebral column supporting the upper body and the head. So there's the functions of the skeletal system. Next slide. So what is the skeleton composed of? Well, it's composed of two parts. You have the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. Axial skeleton is the head and the trunk. Really, it's the head, the vertebral column, and the ribs. And then the appendicular skeleton is really the arms and legs. It also includes the collarbone and shoulder blades and hip bones, or the pelvic bones, the pelvic girdle, and then the collarbone and shoulder blades are called the pectoral girdle. We'll learn those here in a little bit. And there's 206 bones in the human skeleton, and you're going to learn the names of all of them. Yay! So it's in the next couple weeks. So it's not really that hard. It's actually because the bones on the left and right side, and the arms and legs have the same name. So that cuts down the number of bones you got to learn. So since they're all the same name, they're to the left and right. So next slide. So the skeleton is composed of four things: bones, skeletal cartilage, tendons, and ligaments. Okay, tendons, those connect muscle to bone, and ligaments connect bone to bone. Skeletal cartilage are cartilages that are found associated with a skeleton. So it makes it pretty simple. There's cartilage on the ends of bones that help the bones, when they come together, they slide back and forth across each other. There's the cartilage that holds bones together. So And we'll learn about those here after a while. So bone is also called osseous tissue. So there's that word there. And so osseous is a word for bone. And you have two types of bone. There's compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone or cortical meaning around the outside, it's surrounded, so that's surrounded by something called periosteum, which is dense irregular connective tissue. It's composed, you learned that in histology in the tissues lecture, in those slides, what dense irregular connective tissue is. And it's composed of repeating subunits that are approximately 0.2 of a millimeter in size, and those subunits are called osteons. And so you'll need to know that, and we're going to show you pictures of what an osteon is. So spongy bone is composed of irregularly spaced. So compact bone has repeating, regularly spaced, not regularly spaced really, but repeating subunits of osteons. Spongy bone has irregularly spaced beams called, the name for them is trabeculae. Each one is called trabecula. So their trabeculae is multiple, which means little plates, and they're like beams in a building. So they like go and they cross over and around, over and across each other, and they help hold the internal structure of the bone. So you have a bone, and these things go across inside, and the outside is called the cortical bone, and the inside is the spongy bone. And because when you cut into it, it looks like it's kind of like a sponge. There's all these little holes between all those different beams. Bone marrow, and you have those holes there. So bone marrow is found in the spaces between the trabeculae. Okay, and trabeculae, they're composed of instead of having repeating subunits called osteons, they have something that looks sort of like a squished osteon. It's called a lamella, and multiple is lamellae. Okay, and those are irregularly spaced, and they're irregular, but it's like an osteon is a round thing, and a lamella is squished down. Sort of similar structure. Actually, a very similar structure. The spongy bone is covered with, since it's on the inside, it's covered with something called endosteum. Endosteum. So on the inside, your endosteum. On the outside, it's periosteum. So periosteum goes around the outside. Endosteum, you have these plates, and I'll show you this in a minute, but it goes around the outside of the trabeculae. Skeletal cartilages, you have hyaline cartilage and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage is an articular cartilage. Articular means where the bones articulate, where bones come together. So the ends of long bones. Also, it's the cartilage that's found on the end of the ribs, between the ribs and the sternum. So when you actually, if you push right here on your chest, you're actually not pushing bone. It's actually hyaline cartilage. They have fibrocartilage, and this is intervertebral discs. It's also in the pubic symphysis. Meniscus, so the knees, temporomandibular joint, which is the joint between your jaw and your skull, your lower jaw and your skull. And elastic cartilage is the third cartilage, if you remember, and that is in the ear and epiglottis. It's not found in bone. Then you have the other things that are found in the skeletal system are tendons and ligaments. So you have tendons and ligaments, and then you have dense irregular connective tissue is also found there. Tendons and ligaments are usually composed of dense irregular connective tissue is the endosteum and periosteum. The dense regular connective tissue is what composes tendons and ligaments, because a tendon is going to be like you can, let's see, where's one you can feel. If you feel your Achilles tendon way down in there, or you can feel your biceps tendon right about here. If you flex your bicep, you can feel a little tendon there. So you notice it's kind of like a long string. So you need these dense fibers going in one direction. So that's dense regular connective tissue is going all along one direction. Okay, next slide. So locations of compact and spongy bone in a long bone. So this is a long bone here. It's your prototypical long bone. So and it's been cut in a longitudinal section, and so then you take a little tiny piece out of the middle of it here, and this is what this part is here. So we got this little tiny piece in the middle, and on the outside here, this is cortical bone, and on the inside here. This is spongy bone. Okay? And then each of these kind of ring-like structures, like here's one, and here's one. Okay? This is a picture out of your book, so it's figure 8.2. Or each of these is an osteon. Okay? Osteon is, and it has, we'll talk about the structure of these kind of things. Here's a cross section through an osteon here. So there's one there, and here's another one here. Okay? So they have the red and blue are blood vessels, and the yellow is a nerve. So going up and down through the middle of these things. So you have a blood vessels in the middle of an osteon. An osteon is a column. Okay? So it goes all the way up and down the long bone. So it gives you a lot of, so when you have a bone, say, this bone here, this bone here. So there's a lot of strength this way. So since these columns go up the bone like that. Okay, next slide. Okay, if we're in lab, we would be doing this skeletal cartilages characterization. You'd look at these and describe and view them under the microscope. Basically, and then you'd fill out this little chart that's in your book. And so I've already done that chart, and I'm going to go to the next slide and show that chart to you. So skeletal cartilages. So the features that are common to all cartilage, you have cells that are in cartilage. So cartilage is alive. Bone is alive. Bone has cells in it too. And we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. The cells that are in cartilage are called chondrocytes. Okay, and chondrocytes are in a little tiny house. That's what I like to call it, called a lacuna. Okay, the chondrocyte, it builds this little house around it, and they secrete all this extracellular matrix. Okay, so all cartilage has chondrocytes and abundant extracellular matrix. The features that are unique to hyaline cartilage has the glassy appearance. If you remember, we talked about that in Tissues lab. It is found on the epiphyseal plate, costal cartilage, tip of the nose, trachea. So epiphyseal plate, we'll talk about what that is. That's your growth plate it's in a bone. Costal cartilage, costal meaning ribs. So that's the cartilage that's here, tip of the nose, and your trachea has those rings on it. That has hyaline cartilage in it. It's very, very fine fibers, and so it's hard to see the fibers. It's almost impossible to see the fibers. So it looks very glassy and very smooth in appearance under the microscope. It's somewhat flexible. It provides some rigidity, and it also provides very smooth surfaces. So it's a tough cartilage, but it provides a smooth surface. So when you have two bones come together, they can slide across each other really well because they have cartilage covers the end of each one of them. And we'll look at that here in a second. Fibrocartilage. So another way of thinking of it is fibrous cartilage. It has cartilage with very easily visible fibers in it. There's abundant collagen fibers, and this type of cartilage is found in the intervertebral discs. So it's between the discs. So so you have a disc and a disc, and you have a vertebra and vertebra, and you have a disc between. So the disc, when you jump up and down, the vertebrae don't pound against each other; they bounce against the disc. Okay, so it provides cushioning. It's also in the pubic symphysis. That's there's two pelvic bones that come together in the anterior, what's called the pubic symphysis, and there's fiber cartilage that joins those two bones together. We'll see what that looks like. It is compressible. Fiber cartilage is compressible, and then it kind of snaps back. Resists compression forces. It's the least flexible of the cartilages. Then, just to remind you about elastic cartilage, this is not found in the skeleton really. You have abundant elastic fibers. Places you find this are the epiglottis, the pinna of the ear. So you can flip your ear, and it goes right back to where it was. The aorta. So you have those kind of places. So something that needs to flex and then go back to its shape that it was. It's rarely a skeletal cartilage. It's very flexible. Okay. So the ones you have in the skeleton are generally the tougher ones. So the fibrocartilage and the elastic cartilage. Fibrocartilage and the hyaline cartilage are the tougher ones that are less flexible. All right, next slide. What are the structural characteristics of bones? You classify them by shape or location. So in the first classification we're going to do of bones, we're going to talk about the shape. So what you have are long, short, flat, sesamoid, irregular, and wormian or sutural bones. Long bones are longer than they are wide, pretty simple. So like arm bones. So like your forearm bones, your upper arm bone, humerus, that's a long bone. Your leg bones, those are all long bones. Short bones, they're almost equal in width and length. They're sort of cube-shaped, maybe a flattened cube. Bones of the wrist and ankle are short bones. Flat bones, they're flat, maybe curved. They have a thin, spongy bone interior covered with a thin veneer of compact bone. You have the sternum, the scapula, or some flat bones. So sternum is one. So we'll look at that here in a little bit in the shoulder blades, the scapula. Sesamoid bones, those are small bones that develop in tendons, such like the patella, like your kneecap. It just provides you protection against wear and tear. So it gives anterior protection to the knee joint. Irregular bones, bones that don't fit into the other categories. They don't have easily definable shape, like like the vertebrae or irregular bones. Wormian bones or sutural bones, those are bones that occasionally develop within the sutures of the skull, and I'll show you some pictures of those here in a second. Next slide. So here's the pictures, what they look like. So here you are with a long bone, a humerus here, so you can see it's nice and long. So it's nice and long. And then there's a short bone, okay? This is a wrist bone here called the trapezium. And so you can see it's about as long as it is wide. Then here's a flat bone here, the sternum, okay? And they should turn it sideways because it's like that, and then you turn it sideways and it's flat. So then an irregular bone is the vertebra, this one, and then a sesamoid bone, that's your patella there. It's found in front of the knee. And these are found, a sesamoid bone is one that forms and is found within a tendon. Patella is one, there's a couple others in your hand, around your thumb. So anyway, next slide. Here's what a wormian bone or sutural bone looks like. So these, we haven't talked about these yet. This is a suture. So suture in the skull is where two bones come together, and it's kind of this wiggly line. So it looks like it was kind of sewn together, like surgical sutures. And what you get, and sometimes you get inside these sutures, instead of the bones from the left and right side coming together, they don't come together all the way, and before they fuse, there's a bone forms. It's almost like a sesamoid bone. Sorry, that's not a great. Okay, there's a better arrow. It's almost like a sesamoid bone, but it's forming in this suture. So it's called a wormian bone or a sutural bone. That's a good example of one right there. It's forming in what's called the lambdoid suture, or the junction of lambdoid suture and the sagittal suture. Anyway, next slide. So then we can talk about, so we've classified bones. Let's talk about the structural characteristics of bones and bone markings. So there are, you're going to need to know these later on when we talk about, especially when we talk about the axial and the appendicular skeletons. I'm not going to ask you to define these really on this test, but you're going to need to start learning these because we're going to need to know these words as we go on. So you can break these. These are called bone markings. Okay, these are things that either like a divot in a bone, a little cavity in a bone, or things that project off a bone, or rounded parts of bones. That's what all these bone markings are. These are structural characteristics. So you have depressions, you have openings, and you have projections. So we have so there's a facet, a fossa, fovea, and a sulcus. I'm just going through and read these, and so you hear the words. Openings are meatus, fissure, foramen. Projections, there's a condyle, a crest, a head, tubercle, tuberosity, epicondyle, process, spine, protuberance, trochanter, line, and ramus. So back up to the top. Depressions, a facet. It's a small, flat, a little shallow surface, a little shallow depression where two bones meet. Okay. We're going to talk about facets that are where there's a facet of the rib, where the rib meets a vertebra. So it's a little tiny spot with a vertebrae and the rib. The rib comes in, and there's a vertebrae, and they have this little spot where they meet, and on those two places where some hyaline cartilage sits, and that makes what's called a facet. There's a fossa. That's an indentation in a bone into which another structure fits. Fovea is a shallow pit. Sulcus is a groove or indentation along which a narrow structure travels. Meatus is a canal or a tunnel through a bone. A fissure is a slit in a bone or between adjacent parts of bones. And then a foramen is a hole in a bone. So we're going to talk a lot about foramens. We're going to show you some fissures. We'll talk about meatus, canals, and we'll talk about facets and fossas. We're going to talk about sulcus as well. And then, let's see, not too much in bones. We're going to talk about that more in the nervous system. We'll talk about fovea. There's one that's that we'll talk about on the top of the femur, fovea capitis. And then on to projections. We're going to talk about condyles. That's a rounded end of a bone that articulates with another bone. We're going to talk about the condyles of the femur. The femur is your thigh bone. We're going to talk about crests, which are ridges or projections. A head is a round projection from a bone's epiphysis, which is the end of a bone. Tubercle is a small rounded bony projection. Tuberosity is a large tubercle. Epicondyle is a small projection, usually near or maybe proximal to a condyle. And a process is a bony projection. The spine is a sharp, not really sharp in terms of cutting you, but narrows to a thinner line as a process that, and they're long, so they're not long, but they extend for a little bit. There's a spine on the back of the scapula. We'll look at that. Protuberance is an outgrowth from a bone. Trochanter is a large projection from the femur. It's a specialized name for two projections off near the head of the femur, and which is the proximal end near the hip. There's the greater trochanter and the lesser trochanter. We're going to talk about those. We'll get to the appendicular skeleton. Then the line is a long, narrow ridge, and then there's a ramus, which is a branch of a bone. So you're going to hear all these words again. It makes a lot more sense when you see them on bones rather than trying to learn these definitions at this point. I think it's easier when you see the bones and see what these things are, and we just define them as we see them on the bones. So, okay, next slide. So the activity 2 is classifying and identifying bones and bone markings. What I'm going to do is I'm going to there's a handout that you're going to you download, and you'll use that to fill out this table that is in this activity 2 that's in the book. It's pretty simple. But the problem is that you haven't learned which bones are in the appendicular skeleton and which bones are in the axial skeleton. So I've given you that information. Then you get to figure out whether they're short, long, flat, sesamoid bones, those kind of things. So, all right. So anyway, next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about the gross anatomy of a long bone. So we use a long bone because it has a lot of features on it, and it's easier to understand. Gross anatomy meaning large or things that you can see with your naked eye, versus microscopic anatomy, which is things you can only see with a microscope. So gross anatomy versus microscopic anatomy. Anyway, this long bone is the femur, okay? And so we have hyaline cartilage here. That's also called articular cartilage. So articular means where bones articulate, where bones come together. So that's the cartilage that covers the end of the bone where it articulates from their bone. It's going to fit into the hip socket, which is going to go around it like this. So the hip socket is going to have articular cartilage on the inside of it. So you have the head of the femur fitting into a ball and socket joint. Then it has articular cartilage, so the bones can slide, the head of the femur can slide against and move around inside the hip socket joint. It's called the acetabulum. And we have the end of the bone is called the epiphysis. The middle of the bone is called the diaphysis. And so the other end of the bone, since the end of the bone, is called a epiphysis as well. Where the epiphysis and the diaphysis come together, this part right here is called the metaphysis. And we have another one down here. So this is metaphysis down here. Metaphysis is not just a line, it's where it's this kind of region where these two things, the diaphysis, the middle section of the bone, meets the epiphysis on the end of the bone. So then covering the bone, we talk about the periosteum. So that's the dense irregular connective tissue that's all around the outside of the bone, around mostly diaphysis here. and it has what are called perforating fibers. And these fibers from the periosteum actually stick into the bone. Okay, so they stick into the bone, so it holds that periosteum onto the bone very tightly. And then underneath the periosteum, it has blood vessels. This just shows an artery, but there's arteries, veins, and nerves all along the periosteum. So your bones not only have cells in them, but they also have nerves and a blood supply to them. So your bones are alive. And then this blood vessel supplies nutrients and blood nutrients to the exterior part of the bone. How do you get on the inside of the bone? Well, there's something called a nutrient foramen, which is a hole, foramen meaning hole in the bone, and the artery enters the bone at the nutrient foramen and goes inside the bone into the diaphysis. So, let's see. So here's another couple things they talk about in this. And the artery that comes down here is called the nutrient artery that goes into the bone. Then you have something. These are. I guess I'll talk about now. Epiphyseal lines. So these lines right here and right here. Okay. So a little bit off there. Let me draw that again. So, all right. So here's your epiphyseal line right there. A little wiggly. So there's the two epiphyseal lines, and those are when you were growing, those were made of hyaline cartilage. Those are actually cartilage. And then as you grew and the bones elongated, and then those when you grew older, those then ossified. They became bone. And so what's left over is this structure, and you can see this on an MRI or in a CAT scan, those kind of things. You can see those in X-rays. You can see the epiphyseal lines, so you'll see those on an X-ray. I'll show you some pictures of those later on. So then you have it shows red bone marrow here, and this is all spongy bone. Okay, spongy bone, or also called trabecular bone, because it has trabeculae in it. Okay, and so in between the trabeculae is the red bone marrow in those little spaces, and then surrounding the trabecula there's endosteum. Okay, so that wraps, and I'll show you how that works here. A better slide that talks about that, but no, there's endosteum on the inside of the bone, and then there's a cavity on the inside of the bone. It's called the medullary cavity. And then on the outside of the bone is compact bone. Okay, so there's the compact bone. So that's on the outside of the bone. And you see the compact bone there going all the way across this whole thing here. And this is compact bone up here. Okay, that's all compact bone all the way up around there. And so every part that's like this beige color is all compact bone. And the part that's in here is all spongy bone. So that's all spongy bone there. Okay? Spongy bone on the inside, compact bone or cortical bone on the outside. Cortex meaning outside. Cortex actually means bark. So think of bark on trees. So it's the outside part. And then you have in here you have yellow marrow. So you have yellow marrow and red marrow. Red marrow is where you make bone cells, and yellow marrow is fat. And you don't have much fat when you're a little baby. You have a whole bunch of red marrow all over your body. As you get older, the red marrow starts being replaced by the yellow marrow. So, and this shows yellow bone marrow here, and you notice you have red bone marrow up on the proximal end. This is the proximal end up here. You have red bone marrow up here, and then you have down here on the distal end of the bone. Then you have more yellow marrow down there, and so then they show a spongy bone. They label it once again down here, and this would be this stuff right here would all be cortical bone. Okay, so all right, next slide. So here's gross features of a long bone. Once again, you have here's the proximal end and the distal end down here. This bone is actually humerus. So that was femur on the previous slide. This is the humerus here. So this one fits, this is your upper arm bone, so the shoulder would be up here. Okay, so you have articular cartilage there, spongy bone on the inside. Here's your epiphyseal plate there, that little line that's going up, here over to here and up and around. And then you see a little, a little artery going in there, and it's all red up in that part. So it's all spongy bone with red bone marrow. Okay, spongy bone with red marrow all around it. Then we have compact cortical bone, is this number 9 here. Endosteum is this layer of dense irregular connective tissue on the inside of the bone. It also covers the spongy bone as well. Here's a nutrient artery passing through nutrient foramen, so it's entering the bone right there. And then the space that's in the middle of this bone is called the medullary cavity. And then you have the periosteum on the outside. It has 2 layers. You actually have 2 layers of periosteum. There's an outer fibrous layer. That's where tendons and ligaments attach. And the inner layer contains bones for bone growth and remodeling. So you can actually form new bone on the outside. So if you break a bone, then you can actually fix the bone because you have cells that are there that'll help you remodel the bone. So here's the epiphysis on the end. Here's the epiphysis on the end. Metaphysis is this middle section kind of around the epiphyseal plate or epiphyseal line. And so here's the metaphysis down here. It's where the epiphysis and the diaphysis all come together. So diaphysis is the middle section. So that'd be this number denoted by number 3 here. Metaphysis is number 2, and the metaphysis number 4, and epiphysis being number 1, and epiphysis being number 5. So there you go. All right, next slide. And let's see. Okay, so this is just a review of the features. So the epiphysis is the enlarged end of the long bone. Has a thin outer cortical layer of compact bone that surrounds the spongy bone interior with all the trabeculae, all the beams in there, and it often has red marrow in that. The diaphysis is the shaft of the long bone. So so you have the ends, and then you have the end, and the middle of it is the shaft. That's the diaphysis. It often has yellow marrow in that. There's a medullary cavity that holds a bunch of yellow marrow, which is fat tissue. Epiphyseal line separates the epiphysis and diaphysis. It's where the epiphyseal plates of hyaline cartilage were in the growing bone. You have articular surface. It's covered with hyaline cartilage. That's the ends of the bones where they are meeting another bone. Then you have the periosteum, which has two layers of dense irregular connective tissue. The outer fibrous layer, where tendons and ligaments attach. The inner layer containing cells involved in bone growth, repair, and remodeling. It's anchored to the bone by perforating fibers. They're also called Sharpie's fibers. And then there's nerves, blood vessels, and lymphatic vessels that run through the periosteum and into the bone through the nutrient foramen. So they go all around the outside, and they also have little hole in the bone where it penetrates the bone and goes inside and feeds all the tissues inside the bone as well. Endosteum, the inner layer or inner lining of the diaphysis, and it also covers the trabeculae of the spongy bones and lines the central canals of the compact bone. Those are called Haversian canals, and I'll show you pictures of those when we talk about osteons in a second. And not only long bones, but other bones also have articular cartilages as well. So that's not just confined to long bones. Lots of bones have articular cartilage on them because lots of bones meet other bones, and so that's where the bones articulate. So you have to have a little cushion, a little cartilage there to allow those bones to move against each other. All right, next slide. Let's see, activity 3, you looked at the gross anatomy of a long bone. We would look at it in lab. So we'll do I'll post either a video talking about probably like a cow bone, if I can find a good one. That's usually what we do in lab. We look at a cow bone that's been sectioned, and you can see the fat marrow in there and how squishy it is and all that stuff. So little yellow marrow, and see how squishy that is. It's kind of neat. Anyway, we'll do, but I'll post either a video or a worksheet on that. So But basically what you want to do is draw a long bone and sketch a long bone. It doesn't have to be a good drawing, just sketch it. Just do like something like this, and then just label the features. So this is the epiphysis. There's this is the epiphysis here, diaphysis, that kind of thing. Just do all those kind of things for yourself. Okay. So all right, next slide.